The Johnson County War was a violent conflict that erupted in Wyoming in the late 19th century between the powerful cattle barons and the small homesteaders who competed with them for land and water rights. The war was sparked by the cattle barons' accusations of widespread rustling by the homesteaders, whom they called grangers or rustlers. The cattle barons hired gunmen, mostly from Texas, to invade Johnson County and kill or capture the alleged rustlers on a death list. The invasion led to fierce resistance by the local people, who formed a large posse to defend their homes and livelihoods. The siege ended when the U.S. cavalry intervened and arrested the invaders, but the conflict continued for several months afterward. The Johnson County War became one of the most notorious episodes of the American frontier and inspired many novels, films, and TV shows. The story of the Johnson County War begins with the development of the cattle industry in Wyoming, which was part of the public domain open to grazing and homesteading. The cattle barons, who owned thousands of cattle, used the open range to their advantage, claiming large areas of land for themselves and driving away any competitors. They also controlled the political and economic power in the state, influencing the laws and courts to favor their interests. They formed an association called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, WSGA, which acted as a vigilante group to enforce their rules and punish any violators. The homesteaders, on the other hand, were mostly newcomers who settled in Wyoming under the Homestead Act and the Desert Land Act, which allowed them to claim up to 160 acres of land each. They were mostly poor farmers and ranchers who raised a few cattle or sheep to support their families. They often faced harassment and intimidation from the cattle barons, who accused them of stealing their livestock or encroaching on their land. The homesteaders also resented the cattle barons' monopoly of the range and water sources, which they needed for their survival. The tension between the two groups escalated in the late 1880s when a series of droughts and harsh winters reduced the available grass and water on the range. The cattle barons blamed the homesteaders for overgrazing and overstocking the land and accused them of increasing their herds by branding orphan or stray calves as their own. The homesteaders denied these charges and claimed that they were only taking what was rightfully theirs under the law. They also accused the cattle barons of stealing their livestock or killing them for sport. The conflict turned violent in 1889 when two prominent homesteaders, Ella Watson and Jim Averill, were lynched by a group of WSGA members led by Frank Canton, a former sheriff turned gunman. Watson and Averill were accused of rustling cattle from Albert Bothwell, a wealthy rancher and WSGA leader. They were hanged from a bridge over the Sweetwater River without a trial or evidence. Their deaths outraged the homesteaders, who saw them as martyrs for their cause. The WSGA continued its campaign against the homesteaders, hiring detectives and informers to infiltrate their ranks and gather evidence of rustling. They also hired gunmen from Texas to assist them in their operations. One of these gunmen was Tom Horn, a notorious killer who boasted of killing 17 men in his career. Horn worked as a detective for the WSGA, tracking down and killing suspected rustlers with his rifle. In 1892, the WSGA decided to launch a large-scale invasion of Johnson County, where they believed most of the rustling was taking place. They hired 23 gunmen from Texas, known as the Invaders, to join them in their mission. They also recruited some of their employees and allies, bringing their total force to about 50 men. They armed themselves with rifles, pistols, dynamite, and a Maxim machine gun. They also prepared a death list of 70 men whom they planned to kill or capture during their raid. On April 5, 1892, they boarded a special train in Cheyenne that took them to Casper. There they switched to horses and rode north towards Buffalo, the county seat of Johnson County. Their first target was Nate Champion, a popular homesteader leader who had organized his neighbors against the WSGA's tyranny. Champion owned a small cabin near Casey, where he lived with his friend Nick Ray. The invaders surrounded Champion's cabin early in the morning and opened fire. Champion and Ray fought back bravely, holding off their attackers for several hours. During the siege, Champion kept a journal in which he wrote about the dire situation they were in, the intensity of the attack, and his feelings of loneliness. Despite their horses and cattle being killed by the invaders, Champion and Ray resolved to fight as long as they lived. The note was found by a passing cowboy, who took it to Buffalo and alerted the sheriff, Angus McDonald. McDonald quickly gathered a posse of about 200 men, mostly homesteaders, to rescue Champion and Ray. The posse rode towards Casey, hoping to reach the cabin in time. Meanwhile, the invaders realized that they were in trouble. They had expected an easy job, but instead they faced a determined resistance from two men who refused to surrender. They also feared that their presence would soon be discovered by the local authorities and the public. They decided to end the siege by setting fire to the cabin. They threw dynamite and kerosene at the cabin, igniting it in flames. Champion and Ray tried to escape but were shot down by the invaders. The invaders then moved on to their next target, a ranch owned by another homesteader leader, John A. Tisdale. They hoped to catch him and his family unaware, but they were too late. Tisdale had already left his ranch with his wife and children after hearing about the invasion from a neighbor. The invaders found his ranch empty, except for a few hired hands who fled when they saw them coming. The invaders ransacked the ranch, killing Tisdale's livestock and burning his buildings. The group of armed citizens from Buffalo arrived at the KC Ranch shortly after the invaders had departed. They were met with a horrific sight: the cabin riddled with bullets and partially burned, and the lifeless bodies of Champion and Ray. Overcome with shock and anger, they took it upon themselves to bury the bodies. Swearing vengeance for their fallen neighbors, they set out to track down the invaders. The trail led them north towards the TA Ranch, which was owned by John C. Coble, another prominent member of the WSGA. The TA Ranch was a large and well-fortified property, surrounded by a high fence and guarded by several men. The invaders reached the ranch in the afternoon and asked Coble for shelter and protection. Coble agreed, unaware of what they had done at Champion's cabin and Tisdale's ranch. He let them in and gave them food and water. Finally, the group of Buffalo citizens caught up with the invaders at the TA Ranch later that day. They surrounded the ranch and demanded that Coble surrender the invaders to them. Coble refused, saying that he did not know who they were or what they had done. He also said that he would not betray his guests or his fellow WSGA members. Engaging in a siege of the ranch, the group of Buffalo citizens commenced firing at the invaders, who retaliated from behind the fence and the buildings. This intense standoff endured for 3 days, resulting in casualties on both sides and a dwindling supply of ammunition and provisions. On April 9, 1892, the siege was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. A detachment of U.S. cavalry soldiers from Fort McKinney, led by Major Frank Wolcott. Wolcott, a leader in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, WSGA, received a telegram from Wyoming Governor Amos Barber requesting intervention to resolve the situation involving the besieged invaders. The cavalry soldiers intervened to ensure the safety of those involved in the conflict, assisting and resolving the standoff between the invaders and the group of Buffalo citizens. Wolcott arrived at the TA Ranch with about 100 soldiers and ordered both sides to cease fire. He then negotiated with McDonald, who agreed to let Wolcott take custody of the invaders and escort them to Fort McKinney for trial. Wolcott promised that he would not let them escape or harm them on the way. The posse reluctantly agreed to Wolcott's terms, but they were not happy with the outcome. They felt that they had been cheated out of justice by Wolcott's interference and Barber's influence. They also suspected that Wolcott would protect his friends and associates from prosecution. Their suspicions were confirmed when Wolcott took the invaders to Cheyenne instead of Fort McKinney, where they were greeted as heroes by their supporters and sympathizers. They were charged with murder and conspiracy, but they were released on bail and never brought to trial. The Johnson County War was over, but its effects lingered for years afterward. The cattle barons lost much of their power and prestige in Wyoming, as public opinion turned against them for their role in the invasion. The homesteaders gained more respect and recognition for their courage and resilience in defending their rights and interests. The war also exposed the corruption and injustice in Wyoming's politics and judiciary system, which favored the wealthy over the poor. The Johnson County War was a dramatic and tragic chapter in Wyoming's history, which showed how greed, violence, and lawlessness could erupt on the frontier. It also showed how ordinary people could stand up against oppression and tyranny, even at great personal risk. The Johnson County War was also a testament to both human folly, manifested in unchecked power and aggression, and human resilience. Despite facing adversity, individuals united to defend their fundamental rights and challenge the systemic injustices prevalent in society.